Okay, so for the sake of the recording, I'm Randy Kearns. I'm your professor for the class. And this week we'll be going over disaster topics that are specific to New Orleans, and particularly risk associated with the greater New Orleans area. And we also have a second topic that I at least want to hit the highlights of, and that's hemorrhage control. Again, normally this is taught in a hybrid format, and part of this course is taught on campus. And I prefer to teach the hemorrhage control as a part of an on-campus class because it allows us to, again, be able to use a couple of the tools that you would use to help control life-threatening bleeding. With us not being on campus this semester, I'll at least go over the presentation, and then we'll talk about at least some of the highlights and some of the key pieces to it. And then let's talk about assignments for this week before I get started with the presentation. So assignments for this week, you need to create a unique login for your FEMA student ID. You'll need that to take quizzes in the future. I've selected that, let's see, here. So again, does your screen show student identification system? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, sir, it does.
Okay, so if you'll go to this blue bar and click on register for a FEMA student ID, all it does is it allows it creates basic demographics so that you can take other courses that are a part of the independent study program. And we'll be going through several of the independent study courses this semester. The first one is the emergency management certificate. And just as a reminder, all of the FEMA certificates are free. You know, a part of the federal government educational programs for emergency management, particularly through public health, and for that matter through FEMA. Those programs are provided for free. So it is a way that we can build some certifications, again, depending on what type of work environment you wind up in later on. It could be attractive. It certainly is something that I would add to my resume because, again, it's no cost. There's no barrier to entry. And then B, the bigger piece is, again, it offers some basic skills and basic knowledge related to disaster operations and emergency preparedness. Again, as there are certain topics that we'll cover this semester, we'll have one or two and occasionally 3 of these due for that week. Some of them are longer than others. Actually, the first one is probably one of the longest of the independent study courses, but it'll help you gauge and get a feel for what it's like to take one of them. Again, this one will take several hours of your time. In the future, you may be able to knock one out in 2 hours, but this one will take several hours, again, just because of the material and because you're getting familiar with the system. So, as I said, you go to this website. I've got it linked on the Moodle page. You register for a FEMA ID, and then from that, I went ahead and went to, so right here is where I obtained my FEMA ID. And again, each of you can obtain your own student ID. And the whole intent to that was to no longer tie it to a social security number. Historically, that's how these courses were indexed in terms of tracking your student educational programs. And then the self-study course for Fundamentals of Emergency Management. This is the basics of emergency management. It's a good, solid overview of all hazards planning and all hazards preparedness, the 4 stages or 4 components of the cycle of emergency management. Again, what are the basics of disaster operations and emergency management? So it'll take you here. It's IS 230D. The last course update actually is 8 years ago, but I think that is somewhat reflective of the fact that again, a lot of the basic principles have not changed in a number of years. Although I will say the pandemic is causing us to reevaluate some of our fundamental views of what disaster planning and disaster operations are all about. Our experience with disasters in the past have been usually within weeks to months, things are returning to some level of normal. And obviously it's been much longer than that with the pandemic. And so again, it will make us rethink kind of the component of how pandemic falls into all hazards disaster preparedness. Anyway, the course length is estimated as much as 6 hours. Just understand it's built around a 7th grade education, so it should be much easier, much quicker for you to be able to read, understand, and follow through the information that's in this. Why would the course education level be set that low? You do have to consider the fact that this is used for a number of volunteers as well as professional staff around the country. And so if you want to open it up to and be more inclusive to people who have not been as complete or successful in their educational background, but are volunteering and serving their community, this creates an opportunity for a broader audience. So as I say, I think once you get the hang of it, you'll be able to read it fairly quickly, grasp the principal concepts that you need, and then take the quiz. You can take the quiz as many times as you want to, but because of the way they've got the answers stacked and staggered, you can't really guess a whole lot and then turn around and retake it in 5 minutes, and you won't see exactly the same quiz in exactly the same order. So it is important to again look at the overview, understand the basic principles, and then go ahead and start taking the quiz. And you can take the quiz as many times as you want, but that's again a part of that trial and error process of getting used to the system. So those are the 2 big pieces. Once you complete it, it will send you a link. And one of the things we saw in the fall semester that was a little unusual, again, right now there's a large university that the National Fire Academy and the Emergency Management Institute occupy. It was purchased 40 years ago and set up as a university level program to provide short courses for leaders in disaster operations, emergency management, and the fire service. And again, all of that's free as well. Just understand the COVID pandemic has done a lot of the same to them as it has to other campuses and universities. So they've wound up with a lot fewer people on campus, and in some cases, no one on campus. Their systems weren't really set up for that, other than this remote learning program that they have here with independent study. And so they've had some real challenges getting some of the information turned around. What I mean by that is, as soon as you click submit for your quiz, almost instantly you'll get a link that says whether you passed or whether you need to take it again. And sometimes and then they'll follow that up by saying they will send you a certificate shortly, and it comes out as a PDF, and that's what you need to submit. Well, an experience we had in the fall semester was sometimes they would send the notification that you had passed on Sunday afternoon, but they may not get around to getting you the certificate until Tuesday. If you don't have the certificate at the time the deadline is approaching, just send me a screenshot that shows that you passed, and we'll circle back later to the certificate, but the screenshot will be sufficient to show that you completed the assignment in the time frame that it was due. Is that helpful? Yeah, I don't hear any objections, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. Let me close that and close that and close that and close that, and then let's go to. So as I said, we have two presentations I want to go over tonight. One other thing. So last week in the presentation, I included information about the Station nightclub fire. And here's some actual video footage of how quickly the fire evolved from smoke to a fire to a catastrophic event that claimed the lives of I think 97 people and seriously injured another 140. So anyway, if you're interested in seeing that, I did include that. I've also got a video included on how to use a tourniquet. I will talk about that a little bit later in the second presentation tonight. But let me go ahead and hit the highlights again of the historical background for disaster operations and vulnerabilities in the greater New Orleans area. So let's see, let me move. I'm going to have to change the screen I'm sharing. Let me change it to that one and share that one. And let me move this one here so I can continue to look at the camera. Otherwise, the screen that I'm now showing you is there, and I know it drives me nuts if someone's not looking at me when I'm trying to talk, so let me move my material here. And so a part of this comes from a couple of presentations that were done in terms of analyses of what types of threats have occurred and what types of risk exist in the greater New Orleans area. And you know, there is a simple thing that we wind up saying on a regular basis, and that's run from the water and hide from the wind. The greatest number of people who will die in a disaster year in and year out typically is from flooding. It's amazing the power of water. It's amazing how quickly it can rise, and it's also incredibly destructive. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that flooding is the first clear and present danger that we deal with. A lot of times when we think about hurricanes, we think about the wind impact, or certainly with tornadoes, the wind impact. And it's certainly a hazard. And depending on what type of structure you're in, potentially a vulnerability. But the greatest threat that we face, particularly in New Orleans, where about 50% of the city lies at or below sea level, is the water and the flooding issue. And so let me give you just one example of the power of the wind and the power of a hurricane. And I'll do this in the context of having lived in the Carolinas for about almost 60 years. I had a very good feel for the experience of the hurricane impact there. So let me try and translate that between Louisiana and North Carolina, since actually four of the most at-risk states in the United States as it relates to hurricanes are Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and North Carolina. And so if we look at this image of the state of Louisiana, and we look at this hurricane approaching, remember, this hurricane is turning in a clockwise fashion. And the best way to think about how that wind rotation around the center of the storm is causing movement in water, the best way to think about that is imagine holding a cup of water in front of you and blowing across the top of it. If it's completely still and you're not moving the cup, the water is down below the top of the cup. But if you blow across the top of it, and you blow particularly with a lot of velocity, you'll blow water out the other side. It's important to think about that context when you also think about how the wind speed around the center of a hurricane is pushing water called storm surge out in front of it. There's also a lifting motion as that circular motion of the hurricane takes place. And that lifting is also, again, sucking moisture up into the storm, building the size of the storm, but at the same time also causing the level of the ocean to rise. And that storm surge and that wind motion can cause substantial wave movement and substantial flooding in front of it. There's another thing that can also be a part of this to make matters worse, and that is, are we at high tide or low tide? Where's the moon in the context, and where are we at tide-wise? That can also impact flooding. So again, if we think about this hurricane here moving in a clockwise fashion, it's going to be pushing water in this direction, okay? Well, it's over toward Mississippi, and that's a problem in this area, and it's certainly a problem in this area. But as this passes over, understand now the pressure is going to be pushing back down. So let me give you an experience from the Carolinas, and then bring that back to Louisiana. Just a minute. So if you've ever been around North Carolina, there's a particular area that a lot of people like to vacation and travel to. It's called the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It's a series of islands that lie off the coast of North Carolina. Cape Hatteras is probably and Hatteras Island is one of the more common of those islands. So this picture is actually from 1846. 1846, a hurricane approached the state of North Carolina, and the state of South Carolina for that matter. But again, as you can see, this wind motion around this hurricane moving forward, it's pushing water up into what's called the Pamlico Sound. Well, as it passed, so to begin with, it pushed water into the Pamlico Sound, and then later it pushed water back out of the Pamlico Sound. Well, as it pushed water out, it couldn't push it back through the small openings that were there, and it broke apart this landmass into multiple islands. And again, I'll get back to that in a minute. Just understand that same experience occurs in Louisiana, in any low-lying area for that matter. It certainly would occur in Florida. Just it requires a large water area for it to be particularly challenging. And a large water area back to Louisiana takes us to Lake Pontchartrain. Another aspect of how low the state lies is to think about the flooding that existed here in 1927. If you're a fan of Aaron Neville, he has a song named Louisiana, and it talks about the narrative of the song is wash the poor farmer's land away. As much as a third of the state of Louisiana was underwater or partially flooded during the 1927 flood. It caused a substantial amount of damage in New Orleans and led to a lot of the flood levee system and levee protection system that we have today on the Mississippi River, some of which is quite old now, and some of which has fallen into a certain level of disrepair. And a part of that was also the Army Corps of Engineers recognizing the importance of having another place to divert water. And then to be honest, there was a certain amount of water diverting itself, but we'll go through a little bit of what's going on there. And I'm talking about the Atchafalaya Basin. So here's the Mississippi River and the Morganza floodway up north of Baton Rouge. And then down here, the Bonnet Carré spillway. The Bonnet Carré spillway was actually a man-made connection between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. And that spillway can open in an effort to be sure that enough water is diverted away from the city of New Orleans that the city is no longer flooded. And so that's why today, whenever there's substantial flooding upstream, those floods no longer threaten New Orleans anywhere near the way they once did. The 1927 flood is one huge example, but there are other times that the entire city has been flooded out by flooding on the Mississippi River. Well, again, after the Bonnet Carré spillway opened, that was really no longer a threat, and certainly with the Morganza spillway, although we will talk about in a minute why that could be a bit problematic. The other thing, though, that we need to think about, the creation of the Bonnet Carré spillway was really that recognition that the only way into the city of New Orleans is to travel across a bridge, and a bridge that crosses a body of water. And what that really means is the city of New Orleans is really one of the largest islands in the United States. We are surrounded by water, and then the challenge that poses is in time of evacuation, we have a limited number of lanes of travel for us to be able to evacuate the area. Here's a cross section. It's illustrated in a way to at least help us understand. It is important to remember the height of the Mississippi River is higher than the height of Lake Pontchartrain. And the reason for that is Lake Pontchartrain sits down at the level of the Gulf of Mexico, because it's really it's brackish water. It's part salt water, and that brackish water is a reflection of the fact that there's a lot of water from the Gulf that comes into the Lake Pontchartrain area. The Mississippi River, though, on the other hand, is still higher, and obviously water from a higher level is going to transfer down to a lower level. So obviously the Mississippi River is going to be higher continuously upstream until it travels down to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, as we look at a cross section of the city of New Orleans, what that also tells us is most of the area, particularly in the Gentilly area and New Orleans East, those areas are reclaimed swampland. And while well-intended at the time that they reclaimed the swampland, the intent was to drain the swamp to destroy the mosquito habitat, to limit the number of yellow fever cases. Tens of thousands of people were dying of yellow fever each year. So between yellow fever and malaria, we had, basically a pandemic every year in New Orleans during the 1840s and 1850s. Well, by draining the swamp, it killed the habitat for millions of mosquitoes, and it also created land. But at the same time, when you drain a swamp, the best way to think about that is if you take a sponge that's filled with water, and then you measure the size of that sponge and you squeeze all of the water out of it, what happens to the sponge? It gets much smaller. The same thing happens with a marsh and a swamp area if you take all of the water out of it as well. And then you can also see where the levees exist. Be sure that's down. Then you can also see where the levees exist here on the Mississippi River, and then the levee over here on Lake Pontchartrain. Again, it is important to remember that about half of what's considered the city of New Orleans, and certainly a lot of the old city, so to speak, is built primarily around the river. And because it's around the river, it does set above sea level. That's below maximum flood level on the river, but it is above sea level. And then here's just another look at, again, the Mississippi River, the Gentilly Ridge, which is kind of the high point between the river itself and Lake Pontchartrain, And then where UNO sets obviously below the river level, but just at or below the high water mark for Lake Pontchartrain. And UNO sits, again, safely behind a very large levee as well. But that's why it's also important in terms of protecting the levee system and being sure the levee system stays intact. Another way to think about a levee is to also remember that a lot of levees occurred naturally over the decades, and for that matter, over the centuries. Now, parts of the Mississippi have rechanneled itself through the years. And so as it does, area fills up with silt, and when it does, it'll develop a new channel. Well, when it does, sometimes it shortens lengths of the Mississippi, sometimes it extends lengths. We've spent a lot of money, we as a country have spent a lot of money over the last 100 years to try and channel the Mississippi and maintain the direction of flow the way it is. Although later there's an article I want to be sure and reference where clearly that could be problematic. So this also gives you an idea of how a natural levee is created. And it's created by flooding, and then after flooding and after the flooding subsides, those particles being deposited on the banks of the river. So again, natural levees are common, and a lot of, if you think about the Mississippi in 1910, 1920, a lot of the buildup around the Mississippi down by the riverfront had naturally occurred over hundreds of years. What else do I want to be sure and show you? Hurricane Betsy did a lot to change, again, some of the geography of what is Orleans Parish, and for that matter, Plaquemines Parish and St. Charles Parish. Just no, not St. Charles, I'm sorry, St. Bernard Parish. But again, the whole point to that is recognizing the fact that a lot of this area sits very close to sea level to begin with, so it doesn't take a lot of inundation for these areas to become submerged. This is a look of how some of the channels and then some of the levees were first constructed, again, with the idea of allowing water flow to occur naturally, but yet to create a levee system to protect areas where a lot of the people live. As we look through the history, this is the plans of New Orleans in 1829. Again, as you can tell, a majority of the population lived down near the riverfront. And then most everything out toward Lake Pontchartrain was marsh area. Again, by 1849, some of the first levees or some of the first canals had been dug. But again, that was just following natural bayous that existed. And again, the intent was to help drain some of the area, but that wasn't heavily done until the late 1800s, early or late 19th century. And so 1863, a series of east and west feeder canals are built. Again, the idea is to help drain some of these areas. And again, if we look back at the history of our community and the greater New Orleans area, substantial numbers of people, again, it wasn't unusual for 10,000 people to die over the summer, either because of malaria or yellow fever. More likely yellow fever than malaria. But if we look at the history of hospitals in and around the New Orleans area, they would open specialty hospitals just for people to recover from yellow fever. And there were, again, thousands and sometimes more than 10,000 people that would die each year from yellow fever. So the idea of draining the swamp was to kill the habitat for the mosquitoes that once we came to understand what was causing the yellow fever anyway. So here's another picture of canal drainage being constructed. And then 1890, looking along some of the canal area. And then 1895, again, just giving you a cross section of what the natural levees were and then what some of the built up levees look like. But again, just giving you an idea of how they saw this about 125 years ago. And then the drainage system that started being built or that was designed. And here's the drainage system that existed in 1903. Again, if you look at some of the canals that were present at the time, it does give you a feel for what type of a really an engineering marvel it was for the city to even exist the way it did. Again, why drain the swamps? One of the most important reasons was to kill the habitat for the mosquitoes that were killing thousands of people each year, and again, in some cases, more than 10,000 people. Yeah, the single highest annual death rate of any state during the entire 19th century was 1853. It was related to malaria and yellow fever. This gives you an idea of one of the sizes of what's called a wood pump. And the wood pump is a screw design. And in fact, many of these pumps are still in operation today. After Hurricane Katrina, a number of them were rebuilt, but it was determined that the design was still quite current, quite accurate, and quite capable of being a critical part of what's needed to help lift and push water out of the New Orleans area. This is a 14-foot diameter pump. There's almost 200 of these that exist. I think it's 194 or 197, something in that range, but there's a substantial number of these that still exist in and around New Orleans. And this is the drainage system in 1992. Now, so it makes sense to drain the water. It also makes sense to have levees. The challenge with levees is what type of slope do you need on the side of the levee away from the water? And the challenge with that is, in some cases, we've built right up next to the levee. In some cases, we've built houses on this body of water that, you know, for most of the time was okay until there was substantial flooding, and then it wasn't okay. And then when we came back and built levees, well, you know, people didn't want to give up their homes. And so in many cases, the levee comes right up to the backyard, as you can see by some of these pictures. And so it creates this really steep wall. And when you have a really steep wall, it creates a real challenge with the stability of the levee itself. And then this also gives you an idea of the type of levees that exist in and around New Orleans. This is a picture showing where levees failed. There were approximately 47 levee failures during Hurricane Katrina. And they failed for a number of reasons. And because the levees failed for a number of reasons, it left us with, you know, with a real challenge of A, building back the levees, B, when you build them back, hopefully you build them better than they were before. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about the construction of the levee and what's needed. And so we as in a government, the federal government that you and I fund, have spent about $14 billion on the levee system since Hurricane Katrina. And as a friend of mine with the Corps of Engineers told me probably a year ago, I was talking to him about, are we safe? I asked that question, are we safe in New Orleans? And he said, you know, I think the word you're looking for is safer. He said, we're safer than we were in 2005. We're certainly safer than we were in 1965. He said, we're safer than some cities like Tampa, Jacksonville, Miami. We're safer than Houston. He said, but don't ask me if we're safe. He said, you know, with some of the challenges that we can foresee in our future, he said, there's, you know, the next large storm that impacts any of those large cities will be substantial. And even with this build out, will challenge us to be able to weather the storm and recover from it. The storm that occurred about Thanksgiving, I'm sorry, Halloween of this past year, reminded us that even with a Category 2 storm, and that was borderline Category 3 storm, you know, we need to be prepared for these types of storms and this type of activity. The other piece that I would point out in this that I think is a weakness in our design is we've still not done a good job of what's called compartmentalization. In other words, if you look at some of these gaps, to better understand this is only a picture of the levees. It doesn't include the topography, and I understand the topography accounts for part of that. But it is important to create compartmentalized areas so that even if a levee fails and you have some flooding in one part of the city, it won't completely inundate or flood all of the city. And so it is important to think about compartmentalization. I am told that's being considered, but that was not a part of the design after Hurricane Katrina. And so therefore that's not a big part of the process at the moment. And so this gives you an idea of flood stage and water stage at the peak of the storm during Hurricane Katrina until the gauge failed. And the whole point to that is to, again, help you understand Lake Pontchartrain. If we think back to that first image I gave you, as the hurricane moved ashore, it moved ashore in the Mississippi area, came ashore in Waveland, Mississippi. Well, that was ground zero. Well, think about this thing moving and then how this thing is moving. Where's the water being pushed? To some extent, more of it was pushed to the north shore than to the south shore. But there was still substantial failure around the south shore, and there was a lot of flooding around the north shore. Lake Pontchartrain is this big, very large and reasonably shallow body of water. And so therefore it is easy to push a lot of water out of that big body of water with storm surge. This also gives you an idea of how deflection occurs. And when we talk about deflection, that's where gaps can occur within the levee. And again, all it takes is one breach, one failure at one point. And when that one point fails, everything within that levee is at risk for exposure and water release. And that's why I say if you can compartmentalize those areas, even if you lose that section, you don't lose the entire city. And this is just a little bit more of an example of dragline building construction of the levee system. A part of the levee system was also building canals and using the canals to help divert and manage water flow in and around the city. The Inner Harbor Navigational Canal is certainly one of those. This is the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where the barge that broke loose and destroyed a levee and allowed water to flow quickly into the lower Ninth Ward. Again, just understand there were approximately 47 levee breaches during Hurricane Katrina. Sometimes I've had people try to tell me this was the only levee failure. Well, there were lots of levee failures. This was probably the most catastrophic of them, and also reflects the fact that, you know, barges become weapons if they're not very well secured, and on the approach of a major storm have to be very well secured, and if they're not, you have this type of catastrophic result. And it's kind of tough to see, but if you look, that's a school bus that's under the barge, if you want to get a context for how large that barge is. Yeah, so this also shows you some overtopping of a levee. Again, a part of the challenge we had with our levee system was the levees weren't well constructed or weren't constructed of solid material. They have been built back with much harder, more dense material that should withstand more storm surge. Again, it will be better and we're better protected, but we're not absolutely protected. This is just another look of the storm protection system that's been built around the New Orleans area. And again, it's a $14 billion project, so it is substantial and should provide us substantially more protection than we've ever had at any point. And then there's some additional projects that are part of the master plan. This master plan would spend $50 billion over 50 years in terms of hurricane protection. But one of those pieces includes sediment diversion and restoring as much of the marshland as you can. And the reason that's important is you've got to have a place for that storm surge to absorb, to create a buffer from water being pushed in from the ocean on the approach of a hurricane. Let's kind of skip through that just a little bit because I want to get back to, is there anything else here I want to be sure and cover? Yeah, that's pretty much it for the, so later on in the semester, we'll have a specific presentation on hurricanes and a specific presentation on flooding. And I'll talk a little bit more about how those two particular types of hazards impact us all, but I'll also use New Orleans as an example in dealing with that. So let me close that out, and I want to pivot to hemorrhage control. At this point, though, let me stop and say, are there any questions over regarding flooding or some of the risk associated with hazards that we face in the New Orleans area? Okay, so I don't hear anything. Let me go ahead and hit some of the highlights of the hemorrhage control. Let me again check my screen sharing to be sure that the screen I'm sharing is the one you're looking at. Okay, so that's right. And so in talking about hemorrhage control, this. So again, in talking about hemorrhage control, I do want to briefly go through the vasculature, the anatomy and physiology of the human body, and then understand what type of weapons can lead to the greatest amount of blood loss. I will tell you that some of the pictures that I use are a bit graphic, so I'll be sure to give you forewarning, but the intent is to show you what type of injury may produce the greatest amount of blood loss, and then what are things that we need to do to put ourselves in a position to be able to help someone. There is a specific presentation where we talk about the mnemonic of run, hide, fight, particularly as it relates to any type of a weapon attack, either in the workplace or in a school setting or in a church setting. And one of the things that I have to remind you, I have a number of friends in the law enforcement community, and just understand, if you think back to Columbine, occurred in 1995, I believe it was, they saw that type of attack, and that was really the first large-scale attack of that nature, and they saw that as more of they, as in the law enforcement profession, saw that as more of a hostage negotiation, bank robbery type scenario, and the outcome of that was That's not the case. The case is, in a bank robbery, you have people robbing the bank with the intention of taking money and leaving before the police arrive. And if they get bottled into the bank, they still want their money, but they never went to the bank to die themselves. They only went to the bank to inappropriately withdraw large amounts of money. And the difference with a school shooting or a church shooting or some type of a mass shooting type event, in most of those cases, people that are doing that expect to die. And so that changed the way police look at these types of events. With Columbine, they closed it off and hoped to open a negotiation with the two people who perpetrated the crime. And meanwhile, they had killed most everybody and had killed themselves in the first 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and certainly the hour that unfolded. And by the time they were able to go in, they found a lot of people were dead. And so it really changed the tactics of law enforcement, who consciously looked at that and thought, what do we do different? Just understand, if there's an active shooter type scenario today, their intent is to attack the area as quickly as possible and suppress the shooter as quickly as possible. And the point that I'm making here is, if you're involved in one of those situations and a policeman shows up, you want to be sure, first of all, he or she fully understands you're not the shooter. And then once they clear you, they're going to continue on. If you have a life-threatening injury, they're still going to continue on. Their job is not to be there to provide you medical assistance. Their job is to find and neutralize the shooter. And so in saying all of that, if you're involved in an active shooter situation, you may be, and you're injured, you may be your lifesaver. If your friend is injured, you may be their lifesaver. Just understand, some of the first arriving people are not going to be their lifesaver. Their first mission is to find and neutralize the shooter, and it's not to rescue you. And so in mentioning that, I also need to talk about a little bit about weapons, and to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the human body and what parts of the human body can be injured that cause more blood loss than others. Anyway, I want to be sure and mention that. So we do want to talk a little bit about gunshot wounds, different types of ballistic differences, meaning what type of bullet was used in causing the injury. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but I do have the information here if you're interested in reviewing it. The difference between what a gunshot wound will do versus a stabbing or some type of a knife wound. An accidental injury can obviously cause just as much blood loss as a purposeful injury. I've talked about the active shooter and the medical care component. And then managing life-threatening bleeding is really about direct pressure, elevation, pressure points, and understanding how to use a tourniquet. And I'll say that again: direct pressure, elevation, pressure points, and really it's direct pressure and tourniquets. And so I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So the circulatory system is really made up of, the heart is that central pump, and it pumps blood to all parts of the body. It goes away from the heart in something called arteries. If you want to feel your pulse, if you take your index finger and run it just over top of this bone on the thumb side is the radius. And so if I put my two fingers next to this bone and I push down, I should feel a pulsation. Another place to feel a pulse is I feel my trachea, my windpipe, and I slide to the side. And there's a muscle here called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's not necessary you know the name of it, but there's a muscle there. And if you press down, you can feel the pulsation. Well, any place that you can feel that pulsation, that's where arteries are distributing blood to other parts of your body. The carotid arteries distribute blood to your brain. The brachial artery distributes blood to your arm. The femoral arteries distribute blood to your legs. Again, not important that you know the names of them. Just understand a vessel moving blood away from the heart is an artery, and it's pulsating. And if that's damaged, that is a life-threatening condition. If one of those vessels moving blood away from the body is damaged, it's a life-threatening situation. And you will literally see blood spurting out of the wound. And so it's incredibly important for you to apply direct pressure to that area and potentially use a tourniquet to stop that blood flow. Otherwise, this person is going to die. Okay, so again, I can't say that enough. If you see, and it's more bright red, if you see blood that's more purplish and it's oozing, but it's a continuous flow, that's from the venous side, that's returning to the heart. It's not pulsating. It still could be dangerous, but it's far less deadly than an arterial injury. So again, here's pulse points. A pulse point is really any place that an artery crosses over top of a bone, and a place that you can press the artery between the surface of the skin and the bone and feel the pulsation. We can also use these pulse points as pressure points to help slow the flow of blood beyond that area. So again, if you want to take just a moment to locate your radial pulse or your carotid pulse. The whole point is to understand the blood flow in the body and to understand what you would see that could be the greatest threat of life to your friend or to yourself if you're injured. And again, different types of bleeding injury scenarios. I'm gonna move over these gunshot wounds quickly. If you don't want to see some of this, I've got a couple of pictures coming up. I'll tell you, you may want to look away just a minute. I'll talk just a little bit about ballistic differences, stabbings, and accidental injury. A typical defensive weapon is a sidearm, a handgun. An offensive weapon is more like a rifle or a shotgun, but those are considered offensive weapons. Whether it's offensive or defensive weapon, we're far more likely the weapon of choice for an active shooter is an offensive weapon. It's usually a rifle. It's usually some type of an AR-15 or a SIG, or but it's more likely to be I said a SIG, that's not right, but it's more likely to be a weapon that has a 30-shot clip in it. It allows you to squeeze, it's semi-automatic. It allows you, each time you squeeze the trigger, it fires a round. If you have a bump stop, then every time it feels the bump, that actually activates the trigger to cause it to fire a lot faster, more like an automatic weapon, although typically an automatic weapon is only going to be available to law enforcement or certainly the U.S. military. And then different types of bullets that are used as projectiles from those weapons. Obviously, rifle caliber weapons are much larger bullets, and then the type of bullet and how the bullet is jacketed will also cause different types of damage. Shotgun shells also in this comparison. This is the difference between a full metal jacket versus a soft point or a hollow point. And just to understand, the soft point or the hollow point will spread out once it's impacted. And the point to that is it goes in making a small hole, and if it exits, it'll come out making a much larger injury. Let me skip that. I'm sorry. So I have a couple of injuries coming up just to give you an idea of the difference between an entry wound and an exit wound involving some of those weapons. If you want to look away just a couple of minutes, I'll tell you when we don't have that slide again. So these are bullet wounds to the foot. small entry wound, large exit wound to the chest. And the biggest challenge with this chest injury is that's right over the lung, could collapse the lung and kill the patient quickly. I've got another wound injury showing on the next slide. This is more of an accidental wound. Obviously, the stabbing. This knife is actually pulsating because the knife is impaled in the patient's heart. More than once, I've seen those patients actually survive. The key is obviously not pulling the knife out and supporting it until this patient can wind up in surgery, and a surgeon can replace the knife wound and close up the injury to the heart before the patient bleeds out. So active shooter, again, let me kind of skip through most of this. We'll talk about this later on. Just understand, once again, if you be sure that you show that you're not a threat to the arriving officers. Be sure that you're doing your best to help yourself or help your friend, and to take cover and stay safe until someone arrives. But just also understand, some of the first arriving officers are not there to rescue you. They're there to suppress the other shooter, or suppress the shooter. And let's kind of move on. Again, we'll cover most of this in the active shooter part. It is important to, it's kind of comical, but it's important to remember all bleeding eventually stops. That's the bad news. We want to stop it ourselves. The best way we can stop it is direct pressure. That's the most common way that we attempt to stop bleeding, is direct pressure. It's using some type of a bandage, pressing it directly on the wound, and putting as much pressure as we can on it to control the bleeding and allow that area to coagulate and for the bleeding to stop. You can also elevate the extremity if the injury is on the arm. By elevating the extremity above the level of the heart, it makes it harder for the heart to pump blood up to that injured area. So I can apply direct pressure, but I can also elevate it. Somebody else can come along behind me and apply pressure on something called a pressure point. But really, the two most effective means to stop life-threatening bleeding are direct pressure and the use of a tourniquet. So this is an example of a tourniquet. Again, normally at this point in the class, I would hand out tourniquets and we would apply them. I've got a picture coming up that shows how a poorly applied tourniquet can allow someone to bleed out. So again, if you want to turn away just a minute, this is an injury to an injured soldier, a poorly designed tourniquet. This soldier bled out and the soldier died. Again, nobody wanted him to die. They just did a poor job of developing an improvised tourniquet. So you can look back at, again, tourniquet do's and don'ts, and then we'll wrap up with this slide, these two slides. Apply the tourniquet. You can apply it without removing the clothing. Make sure it's above the injury, between the heart and the injury. Tighten it until the bleeding is controlled. Check for a pulse below the injury. If you need to use a second tourniquet, use a second tourniquet. The whole point is you've got to stop the bleeding. If you don't stop the bleeding, the patient will bleed out and will die. And so, and then I've got tourniquet mistakes to avoid. Obviously, you don't use it on someone's neck. You only use it on someone's extremities, either their legs or their arms. You've got to be able to apply the tourniquet between the injury and the torso of the body. And here's just another picture of a tourniquet. They're pretty easy to use. Again, I'm sorry we're not in class so that we can actually use one. I do have additional information throughout this presentation of how to use one, but I'm at that point where I need to stop and wrap up for tonight because of where we are time-wise. But that's a good overview of what we needed to cover for, again, for hemorrhage control and for the hazards and risk associated with the greater New Orleans area. So at this point, let me stop. Are there any questions? Okay, so I don't have anything else to say. I will encourage you to please don't wait until Sunday night to start working on the assignments for this week. This week is a little bit more complicated, and so I would encourage you to go ahead and get your student ID number now, and to go ahead and start working on IS 230. Again, IS 230 will be a little bit more complicated than most of your independent study courses, but once you get the hang of it, I think you'll see that it comes fairly quickly and fairly easily. But this one's a little bit harder, and this one's a little bit more comprehensive. But you have this due as well as the discussion for this week. Be sure and look at those discussion questions. There's some really outlandish scenarios, but they are scenarios that have occurred or have a threat of occurring and create, obviously, a clear and present danger for us to consider. And so I do think it's important for you to think through those things. Pay particularly attention to the article there about the Atchafalaya and the Mississippi River Basin. That is a threat that, again, we'll talk about later on when we talk about flooding. But I think it is important to understand what's going on and what types of threats and risk exist. Obviously, they exist everywhere. I'm focusing on the ones related to New Orleans because we're in New Orleans. Anyway, I don't have anything else for tonight. Do you have any questions of me? Yes. Hannah, if you're trying to say something, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize my mic was turned on.
Okay, that's quite all right. I saw your mic come off. I just wanted to be sure. Okay, well, folks, I won't keep you. I appreciate your time tonight. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you back here next Monday at 4 o'clock on Zoom.
All right, Mr. Clarence, appreciate it.
Sure. Y'all have a good evening.
You too.